Our Dennis Dodd has a fresh power ranking list on CBSSports.com. Here's the visual version. The question is, where would he drop Ohio State? He goes all the way to 8, while the AP poll went to 6. Perhaps as just a placeholder for teams like Texas and Alabama. One more CFP reveal on Tuesday, then Selection Day on Sunday after the conference championship games. A reminder, CBS Sports Network will have the Conference USA title game and CBS the SEC championship. All right, let's welcome in Dennis Dodd, and we've got Danny Kanell from the Cover 3 to get us ready for championship week in college football. Dennis, let's start in the Pac-12, where Kalen DeBoer and his Washington team are almost 10-point under Huskies, if you will, against Oregon in the rematch here. What are your thoughts on this Pac-12 matchup on Friday night?
I just said this off the air. I'm astounded that Washington is such a big underdog. I get that they've won their last 8. I think it's the last 8 by a total of 48 points. Look, if we're going to ding Washington for how they played against Washington State, let's ding Alabama for how they played against Auburn instead of making them glorious heroes. Look, all credit to Alabama for winning the game, but that Auburn team had no business being on the field with Alabama after losing to New Mexico State. So let's have the same standard here, not a double standard. Let's knock Alabama down a notch in the rankings for that. And we're making Washington almost a double-digit underdog. Boy, if I was betting, and I'm not this week, I'd be all over Washington for that number. I think Oregon is probably the better team at this point, the most complete team. They've got the revenge factor. Bo Nix may win the Heisman. But in a rivalry game, second meeting for a conference championship, to say one team is 9.5 better, Vegas, you got this one wrong.
Yeah, Dennis, it's something we've talked about since the Washington-Oregon game. It's just these two teams have been on different paths. Washington, who won the game in Seattle, it feels like they've kind of been lackluster through the back end of the season. Meanwhile, Oregon have been dominant. They've just gone out there and pretty much smoked every opponent that's out there. So I get the number while it's there. Now, the rankings, I think that'll head himself. Clearly, Washington deserves to be higher, but this is really a big number for a conference championship game that you talked about. The other thing I do wonder about, too, is Michael Penix, who I do think he has a sliver of a chance to win the Heisman Trophy. I think this is really Bo Nix's Heisman to lose. Is there something off with him? Because it does feel like he hasn't been the same since that game, and really probably for about a month here. I wonder if he's banged up, because even coming off the field, I know he was emotional and he had the hood over him as they kicked the game-winning field goal against Washington State. But I just wonder if he's been overcoming something, some sort of issue, which is totally normal this late in the season. The amount of hits you take as a quarterback, it wouldn't be surprising. And I wonder if that's why this is such a big number. If there's some people that know something that the rest of us don't, which will be interesting to see. But Kalen DeBoer loves this number. He says, yeah, don't give us a chance. We are, because Oregon was a favorite the last time, I believe, and they went in and beat them in their backyard. So we'll see how this thing shakes out. But I think it's more about where these two teams sit right now, and it's begging you to take all those points with Washington.
It's not often you're the higher-ranked team, you're the undefeated team, but you're catching points. You can play the respect card. Of course, again, that's going to be an earlier kickoff on Friday night. Danny, we're going to get to your Florida State Seminoles in just a second. But, Dennis, of course, you have your power rankings. It's a metric system that we certainly look at, of course, with the AP and coaches poll and ultimately the College Football Playoff Committee. If you were in that committee and had a seat, Dennis, how would you evaluate Florida State one game post Jordan Travis?
Well, look, I think it's real easy to answer that question. I hear this talk on the periphery about Florida State being left out if they win. When did Florida State become North Alabama? They're undefeated in a major conference. They've beaten LSU. They've beaten Clemson. They won a really tough game at Florida. They're missing their quarterback. We know that. They're less of a team, less of an offense without Jordan Travis. But it's really simple. If they win, if they beat Louisville, they're in. There's never been a school from a major conference that went undefeated that wasn't left out. So there's no controversy there to me. We can have a discussion if they lose, it would be a bad loss to a 2-loss Louisville. But I think they proved something Saturday. Danny, I think you'll agree that I thought it went kind of how I thought it would early on with Florida, the swamp, overwhelming, both teams with backup quarterbacks. And then Tate Rodemaker kind of settled in. And Florida State showed who they are as a team. The defense clicked. They got turnovers. So I give them credit for that. Look, I think Louisville's got a chance to upset in this game. Jeff Brom seems to get up for these kinds of games with lesser teams. But Florida State's path is clear. They're not going to be left out if they beat Louisville by any score.
Dennis, I wish everyone was as smart as you, because you sound like one of the smartest men in college football, which you are. I think you're making total sense. But yet, there are some very powerful voices whose opinions matter, and I guarantee the committee listens to them. They speak on national broadcasts, who have had this opinion that Florida State, could be left out if the right things unfold, even if Florida State loses. Or excuse me, even if Florida State wins, which I think is absolutely ludicrous. I am totally with you. I think Tate Rodemaker could throw 3 interceptions and look bad, and they could win 6-3, and they still would be in. It's just, it's absurd that all of a sudden Florida State is judged in this 2-game vacuum where it is the best team sport in the world. And it takes all 11 guys on both sides of the ball to be a good football team. And good teams find a way to have backups either step up or everyone around them step up to fill in that void. And I thought that's what you had happen for Florida State. I thought the defense played outstanding. If you didn't have the roughing the passer call, which really led to that first Florida touchdown, they only hold them to one. They only allowed 1 touchdown outside of that one. Trey Benson stepped up big in the second half with some big runs. You had guys, Johnny Wilson made a couple nice catches. Everyone around Tate Rodemaker helped him so that when he was struggling early in that game, he was able to kind of, not make the big mistake, and they didn't find themselves down too many points. So I totally agree with you, although there is a part of me that is nervous that if the right things unfold, that this committee could potentially do something that is unprecedented, which is what this would be. And I keep going back and saying, I wonder if these same voices doubted Ohio State in 2014 because they had an ugly loss. They were a 1-loss team. Remember, they lost to Virginia Tech ugly early in that season. I didn't hear many people saying they shouldn't be there. So I think Florida State's in if they're undefeated. It would be nice to get some style points. But like you said, Dennis, I think Louisville's a tough out.
I'm glad you brought up that 2014 Buckeye team with Cardale Jones for JT Barrett that season for Ohio State. All right, let's get a little bit into chaos theory, because I think if you are in Austin or if you are in Tuscaloosa, you're going to need to win. And then, of course, get a little bit of help here, depending on what the committee also does with Ohio State, which currently in the AP poll down to 6. Danny, I'll start with you. Texas obviously has to have that Big 12 championship game. Give me the path here for Steve Sarkisian to want to get into the college football playoff.
It's upsets is what they need. I mean, it's pretty simple. They need Florida State to lose. That'll open up a spot because then the ACC's left out. If you saw it, unbelievable. Iowa was a 3-touchdown underdog versus Michigan, but I think if Iowa beats Michigan, you could see the Big Ten left out as well, which would be crazy. But that's just, there's a few different paths. And I do think if Alabama beats Georgia and Texas wins, I think the committee has to honor what we saw on the field. So I think you're probably a Crimson Tide fan, although in that scenario, if the right things fall into place, you could potentially see Bama and Texas get in if that does unfold. So they need upsets on championship weekend for the clearest path to get in.
And speaking of Bama, Dennis, do you feel the same way as we're taking a look at Bryant Denny with Texas and that 10-point win? But what about Nick Saban and the Crimson Tide?
Yeah, I think this starts with Alabama beating Georgia. That's really the biggest discussion this week because that opens up a spot. And then if you assume that Texas beats Oklahoma State, not an assumption, but for purposes of what we're talking about here, that creates the Armageddon nightmare scenario where you've got those 2 one-loss conference champions vying for that opening, along with a 1-loss Georgia, who is number 1 basically the last half of the season, sitting there as a non-conference champion. All 3 of those at 12-1. Well, who do you got? I think you got to eliminate Georgia for not winning its conference. And then you've got Texas and Alabama for that one spot. As Danny mentioned, ideally you'd have to have 2 upsets for both of these teams to get in, Alabama and Texas. And because that's the biggest talking point, they're 2 blue bloods. But this has never happened in CFP history. We've got this situation. These 2 good programs, these traditional programs, and it would come down to the protocol of the CFP itself. Number 1, not in order, but number 1, championships won. Well, they'd be tied there. They each have one. Number 2, schedule strength. And I'm looking at the metric that the CFP committee, at least one of them they use right now. Texas has the number 4 schedule strength. Alabama's 23. And you can argue about that, but Texas didn't play at Chattanooga this year. It is what it is. If Alabama beats Georgia, they'll kind of be even. Let's call that even, okay, for discussion purposes. No team is going to have a big advantage schedule strength-wise if Alabama beats Georgia. Okay, then what are we down to? Number 3 on that list is head-to-head. And that was a significant head-to-head on September 9th, where Texas beat Alabama by 10, the largest non-conference home loss for Alabama since 2004. And not only did they beat Alabama, they dominated Alabama. Texas held the ball for the last 7-14 without scoring and ran the clock out, shoved it down Alabama's throat. I think in that scenario, that's the deciding factor, and Texas gets in.
All right, we'll all play out this week on the Gridiron. Thanks to Dennis Dodd and Danny Kanell. You can check out Dennis's complete power rankings on CBSSports.com. And then DK, of course, part of the Cover 3 podcast. They have been busy not only getting you ready for the games, but all the coaching carousel news. Another Sunday, the NFL dominated in part by college football head coaches.